Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our symposium about developing digital resources for grief, actually in the Harlem community in New York City. And I'm here really just to facilitate this conversation and to introduce my colleagues, Nicole Alston and Henry Willis. Henry is our co-chair, and he is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Maryland, and also an affiliate of our Center for Prolonged Grief and of the SAFELab at the University of Pennsylvania. Nicole is a social worker who's been working with our center since it started basically a decade ago. And you will also hear from Dr. Desmond Patton. He live streamed his presentation since he couldn't be here today, but he will be with us for the Q&A. And I think you'll find his presentation very interesting. Unfortunately, Reverend Johnnie Green could not be with us today. He had a family emergency yesterday and sends his really regrets. And we do have a clip of his that was made by a documentarian at the University of Pennsylvania that we will show so that you can sort of meet him. And Nicole will stand in for him in doing his part of the presentation. So with that introduction, I will introduce you to Dr. Green.
Began my message today by saying there is an unprecedented level of grief in the world today. Grief that is beyond our comprehension. Grief beyond our ability to wrap our minds around. Grief is real. Touch your neighbor and tell them grief is real. Here in Harlem, particularly in our church, we experienced unprecedented grief during the epicenter of the COVID outbreak, when we lost, I know, at least a minimum of 22 of our parishioners who perished as a result of the COVID-19 virus. Refrigerator trucks lined the streets of the boulevards, both Adam Clayton Powell and Malcolm X Boulevard, housing the human remains of those who perished because they could not be accepted into the local morgue. I wish I had somebody who knew what I was talking about. Somebody shout unprecedented grief.
So that gives you a sense of where we started with this project, and I'm going to turn it over now to Nicole to tell you a little more.
Thank you, Kathy, and good morning to all of you. It's really a privilege to be here. Again, I'm Nicole Alston, and I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are and kind of set the stage for how this began. In terms of the Center for Prolonged Grief, we're clinical researchers, and we developed and tested a successful treatment for prolonged grief, and we played a significant role in getting prolonged grief disorder included in the official diagnostic system. Central to our mission, what the center aims to do is to share what we've learned with the community of clinicians, grievers, and natural helpers. So this mission really aligned with what we did with with Grief Care for Harlem, as you'll hear a little later. This is a quote from John Lewis. "Take a long, hard look down the road you will have to travel once you have made a commitment to work for change. Know this transformation will not happen right away. Change takes time. It rarely happens all at once. We didn't know what would happen, but we knew it had to happen." And that's really how we felt. We knew this had to happen. this is something that in terms of, I've had a number of roles at the center, but one of them is community liaison. And even prior to COVID, there was an unprecedented amount of grief in Harlem and in the community. When we think about this, a lot of the photos you're going to see throughout the presentation were taken by our wonderful student colleagues in and around Harlem. But COVID, Harlem, and the next pandemic, as we see, is grief. By 2022, you heard Dr. Green talk about losing over 20 parishioners, but almost 1,700 people in Harlem had died, and it made Harlem one of the most hardest hit communities in Manhattan. We had the power, however, of connections. We talked about like John Lewis said, it had to happen. The power of connections. It was one of Dr. Green's long-held inspirations to provide the Harlem community with grief support and to address the significant amount of grief among parishioners and in the community. So one thing he did was he created MPAC, which is mobilizing preachers across communities. And so he is the president and CEO, and he's also on the board of directors. So what is MPAC? It's a nonprofit civil rights and faith-based organization. It's comprised of clergy, community leaders that have come together for the purpose of impacting public policy through civic engagement to ensure justice and equality for all people. And so even after 43 years, this is, and these are Dr. Green's words, even after 43 years of engaging in ministry and dealing with an enormous amount of grief, he says that COVID-19 pushed them to the brink. And so what he noted was, he said that he was excited to work with Professors Shear, Dr. Patton, and the team at Columbia School of Social Work at the time on a project that brought together the university and the church, as he frames Athens and Jerusalem. So that's a picture there of Mount Neboh Baptist Church and a picture of Columbia School of Social Work. And so one of the things that it was really interesting because it came up after a conversation between myself and Dr. Shear, and then bringing in Dr. Green, and then that's really how the idea was formed to do this. One thing, that connection that Dr. Green likes to talk about is that it represents, Athens representing the church and Jerusalem representing the church and Athens representing the university. And he really felt that put us in a really good position. And then, given the severity of the problem, this project also aligned with what Columbia World Projects wanted to do. So it just made a natural, it was a really great connection to have Mount Neboh Baptist Church, the church, the university, and Columbia World Projects. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Willis.
Try not to fall. Good morning, everybody. So again, my name is Dr. Willis. I am from the University of Maryland, College Park in the Department of Psychology. And I'm going to talk extensively about our project, which really revolved around community-based approaches to engage in Black communities in digital health interventions for grief. So as a brief roadmap of what I'll be talking about this morning, I'll provide a little bit of background around prolonged grief and that experience among Black Americans. Nicole has done an awesome job introducing our study, but I'll just provide a little bit more context about what we did and our aim, our method, some of our key findings, and then I'll leave you all with some considerations for community-based approaches to digital health research for grief. So first, I want to talk a little bit about prolonged grief among Black Americans. And so the research does show that African or Black Americans have higher rates of, or higher levels of prolonged grief as compared to their white counterparts. And we know that several structural factors such as economic hardship, early exposure to trauma, healthcare disparities, et cetera, can add that additional burden to loss for Black Americans. For instance, studies have shown things such as these factors can prolong the grief process for Black mothers who lose a child. And another example of this is loss related to COVID-19. For example, Black Americans have higher rates of chronic illnesses due to these various disparities, which made them more likely to die as a result of the virus. And this makes that experience of loss and subsequent prolonged grief more likely for Black Americans. But to make matters worse, a mistrust of the healthcare system, high costs for services, and a lack of cultural understanding among healthcare providers often discourage the use of grief services, which can lead to further disparities in resources that could actually aid in helping African Americans cope with prolonged grief. We also know that there are intricate relationships between the experiences of racism, loss, and grief for Black Americans, and that racism carries risk factors for damage to physical and mental health that go on to influence bereavement. Some of these factors include widespread discrimination, poverty, education inequities, employment inequities, disparities in healthcare, discrimination in housing policies, police brutality, and incarceration policies. For example, these experiences of discrimination could lead to anger, sadness, and feelings of helplessness that can make grieving more stressful. In addition to that, poverty or a lack of resources to bury loved ones can be a major stressor in these communities. And in these various ways, racism is associated with increased mortality rates, an increased likelihood of especially difficult circumstances of death, greater likelihood of a range of bereavement-related stress, and greater exposure to risk factors that may lead to prolonged grief disorder. And in light of this background, the current project and the rest of what we'll be talking about today will focus on using these community-based research approaches to explore grief in Black communities, and our work adapting digital health interventions for this purpose. So you've already met most of our team. We're either here in person or you'll see Dr. Patton virtually. I also want to mention Dr. Sandra Baker right there in the bottom right, who is also our colleague at MPAC-New York. And so the ultimate goal or ambition of this project was to help to reduce the mental and physical grief complications among Black Americans in Harlem. And to do this, we worked in partnership with the nonprofit civil rights social justice organization, MPAC-New York, which Nicole introduced to you all a little bit earlier. And at the same time, the project is also leveraging the experience of researchers at the SAFELab at the University of Pennsylvania. And what we're doing there is we're analyzing online writings about grief by community leaders and other members in Harlem to generate insights into the way that grief is expressed online. And Dr. Desmond Patton will be talking a little bit about that in a second. Also, using the insights from a variety of focus groups that we conducted over the previous year and these online writings, we're using this data to modify, first, the Grief Care for Families app, which Nicole will introduce later, and other digital resources for grief. And overall, this research has really become, more than just about these initial goals of exploring grief in the Black community. And it really became healing spaces for people in Harlem to talk about their grief in open and honest ways. And so I won't spend too much time talking about the rationale for the study, but again, I want to reiterate that how this project really was a really great connection between the community and academia, or Jerusalem and Athens, and a really timely study based on a disproportionate impact of COVID-19 loss in Harlem. So what did we do during this project? We had 4 separate focus groups. We had 2 focus groups of community leaders and 2 of young adult leaders. So we had 24 total participants in all. And we actually started with only community leaders, but in those initial focus groups, we kept hearing over and over that the youth really need to be here. The youth really need resources for grief. And so we actually went back to our funders and advocated for additional funds to incorporate youth. And they were supportive of that, and so we were able to actually expand the initial goal of the project to include both youth and community leaders. And so over about 9 or 10 months, we conducted 30 individual focus group meetings with these participants surrounding a variety of topics that really focused on Black grief in Harlem. Each group lasted about 90 minutes, and many of these sessions have been informative for research on grief in the Black community. But it's also been informative to culturally tailoring emerging technology products, such as the Grief Care app, and also machine learning algorithmic systems, which we're using the online writings for. In terms of what we talked about in these focus groups, the first series of groups really revolved around the experience of prolonged grief in the Harlem community. So we discussed questions such as how do people in Harlem talk about grief, how were these conversations before the pandemic, how did the pandemic change how the community talked about grief, but we also wanted to know more about how might historical trauma affect how people experience, express, and adapt to grief. Next, we had our participants actually assess, evaluate, and provide us feedback for an existing app for helping families cope with grief symptoms. Some of the questions, or one of the main questions we asked was, how would you change these modules and what's presented in the app to better meet the needs of African Americans in Harlem and the Harlem community overall? Finally, we really wanted to know, once we got these digital resources created, how do we actually get people to use them in the community? So our final few focus groups really focus on community dissemination strategies. And so we asked questions such as, where do people already currently seek, resources for grief? We know communities aren't, all about risk factors, or it's not all doom and gloom, and that there are resources. And so we really wanted to better understand what the community already had access to. And then finally, we wanted to know, how can we better market this app and future digital resources for people in the community? So I'm going to just present a few of our findings from our focus groups. And so first, we have begun to gain a deeper understanding of the experience of grief in the Harlem community, such as the experience of increased desensitization and numbness to death as a result of people experiencing multiple losses in a very short period of time. Participants often talked about how alcohol or drug use or substance use in general in the midst of grief can be really complex in a community. For example, people may use substances to cope, but therefore this might lead to avoiding the grieving process. But on the other hand, it could also be used to celebrate the loss of a loved one. So thinking about drinking in commemoration, or often leaving bottles at community altars. Participants highlighted that there are a lack of resources in the community for people who are experiencing grief. And they repeatedly talked about the need for grief counselors that were from the Harlem community to actually be available and practice within the community. And so, of course, most of our focus groups were composed of community leaders such as pastors. And they often talked about how they're often seen as the only resource people have for grieving. But this can also really overload them and really impact their mental health. And a consequence of this is that pastors may feel this immense pressure to have to be or look okay for their parishioners, even when they are grieving themselves, highlighting the need for unique resources to support these community leaders. And as you all know, and as Nicole highlighted, COVID-19 inhibited the ways African Americans in the community grieved, and it actually prevented a lot of people in the community from grieving properly or in the historical ways that they have done in the past. But yet, people still found ways to hold these culturally important grieving processes, such as having funerals via Zoom. And then finally, our participants also talked about some of the resilience or protective factors in the community. They talked about how community collectivism can help Black people in Harlem adapt to grief. For example, the community connects or often connected as a result of loss, which influenced feelings of solidarity and connectedness, especially as it related to commemorating loss. Here's one quote from one of our community leaders, and as they discussed their COVID-19 and grief experience. I believe that the pandemic, with all these disparities, impacted the grief in Harlem exponentially because there are so many different factors that play into what happened. Not only are the disparities known, but once the pandemic hit the Harlem community, no one knew how to deal with it, either in the hospitals or in the community. So that heightens everything. And I know that they didn't know what to do because in March of 2020, when I had COVID, when they discovered what it was, they sent me home and said, well, there's nothing we can do. And just sent me home with no follow-up, no nursing. And so the amount of grief that people feel has to be looked at through the lens of being alone, not understanding, not having any answers, not having any support, and certainly no medical care. We've also begun to gain a deeper understanding of how racism influences experiences of grief among Black people in Harlem. For example, losing loved ones to the carceral system is a great source of grief in the community that participants often highlighted. They highlighted how financial challenges and a lack of resources, both for everyday life things and for mental health needs, can make it difficult to adapt to grief or to a loss. They discussed their experiences of discrimination in the medical system and how that can intensify grief, especially for those who have lost loved ones to illnesses. Furthermore, they believe that there is a lack of education in the community about historical trauma for the community and how it might impact youth, which can prolong that generational influence that historical trauma has on grief in the community. Furthermore, they discussed this sense of fatigue related to death and grief, specifically as it related to current events and loss, community violence, and race-related traumatic events, such as police shootings. And also for these participants, they expressed that they felt that there was this institutional indifference to Black grief. And often when we would have these conversations, a lot of negative feelings were evoked when we discussed systemic oppression and how that might impact grief. But again, I always like to highlight that it's not all doom and gloom, and that there are potential protective factors that can help the Harlem community cope with grief. And our participants talked about how they often leaned into these celebratory practices for loss when they lost loved ones, such as memorials, funerals, and again, that feeling of community solidarity. And they also highlighted how there can be this increased sense of community connectedness after certain losses, such as the loss of an influential leader in a community, and how this can lead to those feelings of resilience that help Black people in a community navigate and adapt to grief. Here's another quote of a community leader as they discussed this concept of grief fatigue as it relates to current events. Okay, the sad thing is that it's, meaning violence against Black people, become a normal scene happening in Texas and other bad things happening in the news. There's no closing factors to these happenings. We said we're going to do something. What are we going to do? Who's the nucleus of the situation? What do we do other than say we're going to write this person or this group here or this situation and go to this point here? We don't do it. We just talk about it and normalcy happens. It's normal. We cry, we get frustrated, we get tired, we cry, we pray. We do memorials, we bring flowers to our local agency, our local leadership, and it stops there, and it becomes normal. And so finally, as I mentioned, we were able to actually extend this project to incorporate Black youth, and our exploration of grief among Black youth in Harlem both supported our initial findings with our community leaders, but also expanded what we saw in several ways that were more specific to the experiences of this developmental group. For example, youth participants talked about how grief is pervasive for them and that they have lost many of their same-age peers due to community violence. They highlighted that police violence against Black youth in the Harlem community specifically was a common experience for them, which often compounded their experience of trauma and later feelings of grief and loss. These youth also discussed experiencing high amounts of non-death related losses and feelings of grief associated with losing loved ones to incarceration, drug use or abuse, or housing instability due to gentrification in the Harlem community. And as a result of that, Black youth often felt as if they had to deny or avoid their feelings of grief due to a lack of support, and this avoidance often helped them survive and function on a daily basis. But despite this, they also noted that cultural practices such as memorials and feelings of collectivism also helped them adapt to grief. And they discussed a desire to have more resources for grief support. Here's a quote from one of our youth as they talk about the pervasiveness of grief. I think I'm real numb to grief. When one of my brother's closest friends died, he was like a big brother to me. He got killed in 2019. As soon as I found out that he died, I went to the liquor store and drank a whole bottle by myself. And after that, life was unreal. He was somebody that you think you will never die. Somebody in your head who is like so good. They can do no wrong in your eyes. But somebody felt like they did something that was bad enough to take their life. For my other friends who died, I honestly don't know how to cope with death. I don't even like going to see, how it's awake, and you go see the bodies on your personal time before the funeral. I don't even like doing that because it feels so unreal. And I think death is happening so fast, like at a faster pace now, and that you don't have time to cope. You don't have time to feel, because as soon as you start feeling for one person who died, another person is gone. So as you can see from these findings and these quotes, there is this intense and urgent need for grief resources in the community for multiple developmental groups. And so I'll then lead into discussing some of the findings we had around culturally adapting an existing digital tool for grief. So our project also aimed to highlight modifications for the Grief Care for Families app, which was developed by the Center for Prolonged Grief. And this is a self-guided app for helping families adapt to loss. And with the findings from our focus groups, we're making another iteration of the app specifically for the Harlem community. And so based on our review of the focus group discussions, here are some of the modifications that we hope to include in this next iteration. So first, we want to expand and add new modules about grief as it relates specifically to Black and Harlem communities. So we're including topics such as community-wide experiences of grief and dealing with non-death losses such as incarceration, losing loved ones to incarceration. We're also thinking about how to implement collectivism and leverage that notion of collectivism in the app. And so one way we're aiming to do this is to enable the ability to use the app within a group. So whether it's a church group or a group of friends, et cetera. We also want to improve the appearance. So participants talked about the need to include more culturally relevant pictures, pictures of places and people from Harlem, videos, animations, et cetera. Also, participants highlighted the need for information and skills that focus on empowerment and resilience. They really highlighted how they didn't want an app that just took a risk-only approach and really wanted to lean into some of those protective factors that were important to them. And in terms of how to get the app out there, they talked about, particularly the youth, of course, talked about using social media and community ambassadors to help educate the community about the app. And so finally, I just want to leave with a few recommendations for community-based research about grief in the community. So first, it's important to allow flexibility in the research approach to incorporate things such as healing, spirituality, and other cultural practices relevant to the community. So one way we did this was by incorporating gospel songs during our focus group breaks or having participants share their favorite Bible scriptures at the end of each focus group session to help enhance their mood and focus on resilience, especially after the heavy topics that we often discussed. It's also important to be reflective during the entire process and reflexive to the needs of the participants. So understanding how to reflexively integrate anti-racism approaches in methodology and being responsive to participants during the research process. And so approaching this research from a culturally humble standpoint and soliciting feedback from participants about how to improve the process to address any unconscious biases was an important aspect of our process. And then finally, from an ecological system standpoint, it's important to understand how different systems can influence the research process and engagement with participants, such as experiences of gentrification in the community where we are conducting research, especially those gentrification efforts that may be as a result of the university itself. And finally, it's important to prepare for a plan of ongoing engagement and dissemination. And so be sure to emphasize how the research is giving back and keep the communities involved at all stages. So I just want to leave with a few concluding remarks if you were still letting your coffee kick in. First, racism, historical trauma, and other sociocultural factors influence the experience of prolonged grief for Black Americans. And based on our findings and our work with community leaders and youth, it's important to explore those developmental differences in experiences of prolonged grief in Black communities. And finally, based on our efforts, we've seen that these community-based approaches can improve the dissemination or have the potential to improve the dissemination of grief interventions for its population. So again, I'd like to thank our colleagues at MPAC-NY, of course, Dr. Shear and Nicole from the Center for Prolonged Grief, Dr. Patton, who you'll hear from shortly, and a range of our research assistants that helped to make this possible. It's my contact information, and thank you so much. I'll give it back to you, Nicole.
Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. So I'd like to give a preview of Grief Care for Harlem. You've heard a lot about what went into the focus groups, some of the participants' quotes, and as you were just sharing that, I felt like I was back there co-facilitating. It was an absolutely moving experience, and very privileged to be able to step into the lives of people in that way. The idea was to adapt grief care for families, which was an existing app, to do grief care for Harlem. And so when we think about the original app, it was really to help get to know people's grief through evidence-based information. So kind of learn by doing activities, and so for parents and caregivers. But as you heard from Dr. Willis, that, they were saying, maybe we need to, you could add some music, you can add some images. So it really became these pictures were taken by our wonderful student colleagues last year. The feedback was to make the app more vibrant and to make it appear more like maybe social media posts, or to increase opportunities to be interactive with the app. Include sort of like, as I think about it, for Harlem, by Harlem. So include like culturally relevant pictures, and this is one of the pictures from around Harlem, pictures of places and people from Harlem. And as Dr. Willis mentioned, the idea, I love art and animation. And so just wondering, being able to include something like that. And these are some of the images we're going to use in the app, actually. So animation, capturing through music. Of course, our younger group, they had some ideas about different things, and our more seasoned group had some ideas about different music. So it was a way to, but it's a way to capture the essence of Harlem, its residents, centering the voices of the participants in the focus groups. And again, they didn't want just grief. Even if it was grief, they said, so much has happened here. Businesses have been lost. There's been financial grief. We've lost, there's been relationships. We even, just lost the ability in some cases to gather the way we did. We want to capture all that in the app. And so, again, these are pictures that just kind of capture a lot about Harlem. If you've been there, there's this nostalgia even today as you're walking through. And one thing, this is a quote from Ruby Dee, and an activist, an author, and a longtime Harlem resident. And she said, Harlem is a language. It's a rhythm and a symphony. And I don't know if you've played in a symphony before. I've played the viola for a number of years. When everybody's playing and the strings are tuned up right, it's a wonderful, wonderful sound. And so what the digital world provides is an opportunity to connect places, organizations like MPAC, the Center for Prolonged Grief, the community, young people, older adults. And the digital world allows us an opportunity to do this in so many different ways. It's really exciting. And this is what really makes this symphony so exciting and so meaningful.
Okay, hello, good morning. My name is Desmond Patton. I'm excited to move forward with this presentation with you all today. The title of this presentation is Digital Expressions of Grief Online, the Integrating Emotional Stories Online Platform and Developing Culturally Responsive Technologies for Loss. So my name is Desmond Patton. I am the Brian and Randy Schwartz University Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. I have appointments in social policy and social work, public interest technology, and I also conduct work in the gun violence prevention space. So what we know about the intersections of grief online and COVID-19 is that at least 1,666 residents of Harlem have died from COVID-19, making Harlem one of New York City's hardest hit neighborhoods. And according to the World Health Organization, there has been at least a 25% increase in prevalence of anxiety and depression since COVID. And at the same time, we also see a number of folks affected by COVID, living with COVID, living in COVID, expressing their experiences with grief in online settings, mainly social media platforms like Twitter and Instagram. And we have deep expressions of the experience, the pain, and the coping strategies that are associated with their grief. And so, in order to capture those narratives that are being posted on social media platforms, I partnered with the computer science department at Columbia University in order to create a platform for capturing those stories. That platform is called IESO, or Integrating Emotional Stories Online. And so with our colleagues in computer science at Columbia and the SAFELab team, which is formerly at Columbia but now at UPenn, we recruited over 200 members of the Harlem community and Columbia students. And we conducted and also leveraged focus group participants that were a part of our larger project at Columbia on prolonged grief. We received over 800 posts. These are individuals that are putting in stories into the platform, into the IESO platform, which accumulated into 131 users. We also developed a computational and interdisciplinary approach to automatically identifying grief and the phrases used to express it. Here is an example of how one would use IESO. The user would get a screen that asks them how they're feeling. They are then able to select all emotions that are applicable to this post. And it was very important for us to be able to use emojis so that folks could have a similar social media experience. We would ask them to describe their feeling to describe if their feelings are associated with a particular event, and then to write in description more about that event. We wanted to know the time with which that event happened, and for that user to rate the intensity of the emotions connected to that event. We also wanted to know if this post was related to COVID-19 or police brutality, as these two pandemics were intersecting at the same time. And lastly, we wanted to know if their posting could be public to the wider public of users that were also using IESO. So critical to this project is our collaboration with natural language processing experts at Columbia University. And so we co-created this project with the Columbia Computer Science Department and the University of Michigan's Linguistics Department. My colleagues include Dr. Kathy McEwen, who headed the computer science team for this project, and she was leading the IESO platform development and has expertise in NLP and text summarization. In addition to Dr. McEwen, we also work with Dr. Jesse Grieser from the University of Michigan, who has expertise in language expression and racial identity and language. We also recruited social work graduate students at Columbia University and then later at the University of Pennsylvania as moderators for IESO. And they also worked with us as annotators for conducting thematic analysis, looking at the themes that emerged from the posting behavior of our participants. We engage in a qualitative process, which within the computer science space may oftentimes be referred to as an annotation process. We conducted general annotation of the posts, and what we wanted to know was what is coming from the reader. We wanted to really get at the meaning behind the post that our participants posted. We wanted to also look at the events that were identified. An event that could be one related to loss, loss meaning a particular death of a friend or a family member, a breakup, or even daily stressors like exams and other life events that cause feelings of loss or daily stress. And then we also looked at the response to that event. And then we wanted to really kind of go deeper and understand, is grief applicable here? And then why? Why is the user naming this certain emotion? Why are they naming loss or grief being related to that particular event? And then lastly, we wanted to know, is the event related to the emotion? And so here you have, at the bottom, you have a process for how we conduct our annotations. And so you'll see here the description of the event, what the event is, and then any annotation associated with that event. Could that event be categorized as loss or other, or perhaps there are other feelings identified with that particular experience? And then we also wanted to know from the annotator why they might label or categorize this event as either grief or another emotion. We also conducted quantitative analysis, in particular topic modeling. Topic modeling was used to not only validate themes we saw coming up qualitatively, but to also identify emotions that were present within the IESO posts. And as seen in the chart, joy was a prevalent emotion depicted in the data set and is one of the 4 preliminary themes that our qualitative annotators found in this space. And so we were able to identify 4 themes that emerged from annotating comments from the platform. Those 4 themes include interpersonal grief, systemic and institutional losses, everyday stressors and mental health, self-care, and joy. So I just want to give you some examples of interpersonal grief. One user said, disappointed in myself, thinking of all the things I should have done while he was here with me. Not feeling like myself this morning, I woke up thinking about my friend that passed. I think about them every day. I try to stay busy to avoid thinking about them, but I can't get them off my mind. I've passed sad and hit rock bottom without her. I don't know what to do. I know to keep living, but how do I do it without her? I don't want to be around people who remind me of her. It's just too painful right now. One day they'll bring me joy, but right now it's too much. Here are some examples of systemic and institutional losses. Gun violence. The school shootings have me worried. What is happening in the US? How can we keep this happening? The thought of someone dropping off their child and to pick them up and they're not alive is overwhelming. How can one cope this hard burden? Lost for words. Focus on climate change. Is climate change grief a real thing? This is overwhelming. A deep sense of forthcoming doom. I don't know because it's not like I have personally lost anything yet, but I feel for others. COVID. It's strange how we have all moved on from COVID, like it was this massive traumatic event that it killed millions of people, but we're all conditioned to move on from it. Did we just forget about all the victims? How are we supposed to make sense of the scale of this disaster? And then lastly, police brutality. I feel angry. There's a real war between the people and police, and it really needs to stop. Now moving on to examples around everyday stressors and mental health. I have so many things in my mind. Today has been a rough day. My anxiety is on 1,000. I don't know how to deal with stress. I shut others out and push everyone away. Stressed because my parents expect so much from me all the time. I have my days I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't know what's wrong with me lately. And then we also identify a sub-theme that I think ran concurrent across the 4 themes that we saw. And the sub-theme really illustrates ideas around masking emotion. One user said, annoyed of always being asked, are you okay? Not being able to yell, no, I'm not. Another user said, just imagine having to put a smile face mask when others come around, but behind that mask, I'm probably the most saddest person you'll ever meet. I feel so numb all the time. I was with my best friend and I had to pretend like I was having a good time. So angry because I don't care, but I secretly do, which seems to be a new trend for me. Another sub-theme was self-care and joy. 2 of my family members came by to visit me. I felt calm knowing that I had some company. They kind of ease the pain that I'm going through. Music is my happy place, and sometimes for me, a good song can really help by shaking off the blues. I love feeling joy coming from the people I love the most. It makes me feel loved. I'm proud of myself for all the times I kept going. So I think you've just heard some of the themes and sub-themes that have arrived from our use of ISO to unpack experiences with grief, but also daily stressors. But I think we also have to contend with some of the real work, ethical dilemmas and the benefits and limitations of using platforms like this, right? And so we always need to consider the use of algorithmic tools for complex social problems. We need to think about what accuracy actually looks like within the context of using natural language processing to unpack emotions and experiences and events of grief and loss. We need to be clear about the extraction of context when using NLP and how language process systems derive and analyze and validate content. And then we need to be really thoughtful and careful around the extent to which language models can understand and compute African American language. So I think there are some key takeaways that we should walk away from. I think that it's important that we always leverage critical, diverse perspectives when thinking about the deployment of tools like ISO and AI for the interpretation of grief and loss. I think we need to consider training language models in their ability to understand African American language. And if we do that, does it enable increased surveillance of Black community members? I think AI can be helpful for understanding expressions of grief, but it's not the only tool that we have at our disposal. So we should not overuse tools like this in the grief space. If we're not used thoughtfully and correctly, I think AI can be a tool for bias surveillance and mass incarceration. And so we need to think very carefully about these interpretive tools that are powered by artificial intelligence. And so in our next steps, we have a paper that has been accepted titled Evaluation of African American Language Bias in Natural Language Generation. This is a new paper that discusses training a language model to understand African American language and the pros and cons of using such models. And then we are also in collaboration with Crisis Text Line to look at their data sets and to identify language expressions of grief via text for Black users. Thank you so much, and I look forward to speaking with you all in the question and answer session. Take care.
Right, so thank you both, thank you all for really great presentations, and we are open for questions if anyone has any questions, or if not, we will have a discussion among ourselves. Yeah.
Maybe use the mic because we're trying to record.
Yeah. And also because people who are streaming won't hear otherwise, yeah.
So, first of all, thank you. My name is Ipsit Vai. I'm the medical director of the Institute for Technology and Psychiatry at McLean. And I've been part of this conference for the past 7 years, attended pretty much everything. And I will go ahead and say that this is one of, if not the most important session we've had at any point in the history of this meeting, for a simple reason, which is I think you conveyed emphatically that the technology part and digital mental health is actually the easy part.
That was a mistake.
My question, though, is based on personal. It's kind of derived from challenges we face. That I get the sense that while you may not have solved it, you're probably a few steps further ahead. Which is, to borrow the Reverend's metaphor. The people in Jerusalem sometimes don't trust the Athenians very much. And it's a challenge, I think. We know what we can't do, which is you can't just walk in expecting that people in Black and other minoritized communities will buy what you're trying to sell them, no matter how good the technology. And I think the lesson I learned from your talks is that it actually has to be done at the retail level. You need people that are local to the community, often people that grew up in the community. There need to be strong translators and bridge builders, in other words. And I wonder if you had any thoughts or perspectives from experience on sort of how to bridge that translational gap, because we have good tech. It often works really quite well and can be effective, but getting into the hands of the people most poised to benefit from it, that part's not easy, and I think grossly underestimated.
I'm sure my colleagues have things to say, but I will just underscore that, because we actually did a project with Uniformed Services University a couple of years ago with a digital app, and even in that community. And what we found was there was a great appetite for a digital app around grief. And people, so I think 80% of the people who signed up for that actually opened the app. And the average length of time they spent on it, they had access to it for 6 months. The average amount of time they spent on it was 30 minutes. So there are a lot of issues here, I think, and a lot of it is that translational piece. So I'm going to turn this over because we didn't want that to happen again. So you're right that we did do a lot, and my colleagues kept emphasizing this. If I didn't need to hear it, they kept emphasizing this during this project.
Well, one of the things, thank you so much for that comment. I personally spent about 5 years as a community liaison in the community, so Harlem community. And one of the places that I connected with was Mount Neboh. And so that's really we had a relationship. And so with that particular church, so that's one thing. So it's almost like we were sort of vetted to begin with. And then Dr. Green playing both roles, I don't want to speak for him, but he's a part of Athens and he's a part of Jerusalem in some ways. So then his connection with the community, I definitely think there's no question that helped a lot.
We're not there yet.
Yeah, I would just echo, what they both said. And I think, involving the community early on in the process is important versus just kind of coming and saying, oh, thank you. Instead of just coming and saying, like, we have this thing, like, how can we, get it to you, versus saying, we want to do this thing. Where should we start? What do you need? How can we have you a part of this process? And do you want it? Yeah, important question. And it's still even not easy, even being from the community. I know Nicole and I, we still represented Columbia in a way. So even in those focus groups, there was still a little bit of tension of that kind of outsider versus insider thing. So, also realizing that, it's not a monolith, and, there's still going to be some, trust that has to be built.
Do you want to say anything before we
Yeah.
turn over to Desmond about the racism and the comments?
Yeah, so, again, as I mentioned in our findings, gentrification was a really big stressor for our participants. And there was a lot of anger when, they thought about just Columbia's role in gentrification. And, even in our focus groups, we were the kind of receptors of that anger. And, of course, they would say, we know this isn't you, but et cetera. And then for some, it's still like, we represent Columbia, and so we are still kind of, perpetuating racism or, perpetuating that mistrust or taking advantage of the community. And the white gaze. So we also very early on in the project, we had RAs as a part of this, and some of them did identify as white, were visibly white. And then over time, this became just really upsetting to some of the participants in terms of them sharing and feeling comfortable in the group. And so this kind of relates to the point of being reflexive. And so we asked for feedback, and it was very hard feedback to take, but we were reflexive and we were able to fix things. And the participants really conveyed how much they appreciated us kind of taking into account their experiences. Would you want to add anything to that?
Well, sure. Very quickly, that there are blind spots, even with the best of intentions, there are blind spots, and they called us out on it. And, so it was a really impactful and meaningful learning experience.
Okay, great. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, yes, thank you. I think, one of the things that's coming up for me is us having the conversations around our relationship to technology. And what I appreciated about our project is that Technology, while it was a vehicle for understanding prolonged grief and being able to provide additional support and care, it was not the priority. It was not something that superseded the experiences and the expertise of the communities that we partnered with. And I thought that that was a really important contribution. In addition, we also worked with the Harlem community as domain experts. And so in this particular scenario, technology really was a secondary tool for us, and our connections, our engagement, and our relationship with the broader Harlem community was paramount.
I would just like to echo what Ipsit said. Thank you. I'm so grateful that you came here to share this important work with us. So some work that I've been really lucky to work on and started thinking about is the caregiver and how we can support them just as much as the patient, if you will. And I thought it was really interesting in your talk how you mentioned about the mental health of like the pastors and the community leaders. And in this case, you know, they're essentially the caregiver of the community here. And so I'm curious during some of those roundtable discussions that you had, sort of what tools you think might be most important to support those that are supporting everyone else. Thanks.
Yeah, really great question. I think the first thing that comes to mind is, you know, the importance of them having a space of peers that, you know, is a safe space, because I think that's what those focus group sessions became to them. So they were able to not only be around other pastors and peers, people that they knew, et cetera, but it was also a place where they didn't have to put on that kind of that burden of having to be strong. And they also got to hear how much, you know, other pastors just like them were having these difficult experiences, and that became, you know, a place of healing. And so, you know, if anything, I would love to find ways to recreate that, you know, outside of the research context.
And the other thing that we were able to do, that these guys were able to do in those meetings, were to provide some tools, and in particular, Nicole. So one of the things we do for people is encourage them to kind of monitor grief. That's just something that people generally find helpful. And you did that in a very interesting way. Do you want to describe that?
Oh, the temperature, yes. So one of the things that we did in the beginning and in the middle and at the end, we had a way of, we tried to gauge kind of where they were, how they were coming into the space and how they were feeling. And one of the things, since COVID-19, I don't think there's anybody in here or anybody anywhere who hasn't encountered a temperature check, either with your head or your arm or whatever. So we use that as something, well, you know, how are you feeling on a scale of 0 to 100 or 0 to 10? And we use that, and so that was something that really resonated with them.
And they commented on how helpful they found it.
Yes, they did.
And also we were able to provide some minimal psychoeducation around. There's a lot of confusion in the community around grief. I mean, we all have a lot of community confusion about it. But by sort of, so we were able to very gently infuse some psychoeducation. But I think that, whatever you want to call it, some kind of information, and it's really information sharing, because it's really how does it make sense to them. But there is a framework of information that from academia we often have access to, that we can share. And so I think the sharing of what we have in a respectful and collaborative way, and the very much the community gathering as well.
Anything to add, Desmond? Can you hear us?
Yes, no, I think you covered it.
Okay, great.
Hi, I'm Scott Roush, also from McLean Hospital. I also wanted to just really thank you and congratulate you for this amazing work. My question is, and we've done some work around stigma in different populations, and it's been so striking to me how stigma, though we can think of it as monolithic, is just incredibly, culturally bound. And the work that you're doing, I think, really highlights how important it is to sort of honor and recognize the uniqueness of each person in each community. I'm really eager to hear your reflections given that technology really gives us an opportunity to scale, and in certain ways there's only one Harlem, but on the other hand, what you're learning and what you're doing, gives the potential to generalize it to so many other communities. So I'm eager to hear your reflections on how to think about generalizing from what you're doing to other similar communities nationally or globally utilizing technology.
Yeah, I mean, great question. I think, the first thing in terms of scale is, the first thing I think about, and I know Dr. Patton might say a little bit about this, is that interaction between what happens online and offline too, and thinking about how to take that unique experience and kind of, keep that in mind when we're generalizing to other communities. And so, for Harlem, again, so thinking about what's happening offline in terms of gentrification and community violence and how that impacted, their online expressions of grief or just experiences of grief in general, and thinking about how digital tools can be helped to kind of navigate both of those worlds. And, every community has its own unique socio-historical and political kind of background. So I think, in terms of scale too, I think of creating this, network of community kind of connections, because that's going to be important.
It's a really great question. And I think there's an Athens and Jerusalem in every city. There's an opportunity to connect. And I think what we've learned is that, particularly from our leaders, that we really need this, that this was really helpful, it's really useful, this is what we've been looking for. Maybe we couldn't even articulate what we needed. So I think just finding that Athens and Jerusalem in every city.
Great way to put it. but also that, as you may have heard Dr. Patton say a few minutes ago, first starting by leveraging the community expertise and sort of going into the community with the attitude that we need their expertise and making those connections. I think that in person, did we do it in person at all? I guess we didn't. We started this project during COVID, so it all started in the digital world. But that, I think that's the other. And then, so, and also I just want to remind everyone we're not there yet. So.
One of the biggest things that I learned from this project is the importance of how folks language their experiences with grief. And I think by focusing intently on the ways in which not only Harlem community residents were expressing grief, but also Columbia College students, we saw some of the similarities in the types of language that they use and the types of expressions that they use. And so for me, it helped me to see, while there are differences in the expressions of grief, we also have a lot in common that we can see through the expressions of language that happens via digital platforms. And so I think the digital platforms is an interesting space to continue to explore in terms of scalability, because I think the language piece may offer us understanding of not only our unique differences, but also how we can come together around experiences of grief as well.
Hi, Laura Jameen, McLean Hospital. It was a wonderful session. I didn't think about my makeup this morning and how to deal with like my eyes welling up, because I didn't consider that being a thing that would happen today. So, good problem. Loved all the quotes. I think that these sorts of sessions like this one that marry digital technology with the human experience, often we leave the human experience out because we're talking about scale and tech and AI and machine learning and all that. So I loved it. I thought it was wonderful. My question, sort of coming off of Dr. Patton's talk and thinking about community engagement generally, is we often think about trust as an issue where there is mistrust in a community and we have to reduce that mistrust, right? Like they should trust us and, we have to teach them why that's important. But that's not always true. So the case of the training AI to do surveillance that can lead to mass incarceration, I think is a great, very clear example. More broadly, I've thought a lot about, as someone who's been in the open science space for a while, and I run an open science organization, right? I care about open science, but then data colonialism, right? What happens when we release the data from communities' colors to communities where most of the community doing the analysis and producing results is higher SES, white, highly educated, not from these communities? doesn't necessarily have the best interests of these communities in mind, you know, are there risks that we should ethically be communicating to communities when we engage with them around what the data could be used for, what the risks are? Should we be protecting data from communities of color so that the sovereignty of that data is in those communities? So I just love your thoughts about the general set of issues.
Desmond, would you like to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I just love all of your comments. I mean, I think you're spot on. And I think what you're also really underscoring is why we need to engage in transdisciplinary approaches and methods in these spaces, because oftentimes folks who are designing platforms, who are creating algorithmic systems, are not considering those very deep rooted ethical concerns that come up when you actually spend time in communities. And so, you know, I think some of the workarounds in this space are to, as we've already noted, to start with community, to be hyper transparent about the processes that we're engaged in, and to do our very best to explain what we're doing with algorithms. And oftentimes the public discourse is that algorithms are hard to understand, or, you know, no one really gets them. I think that remains true, but I think unpacking why we're using an algorithmic approach, what we plan to do with that algorithm, and the potential pitfalls and things that we should be anticipating with how algorithms operate in communities should be a part of that conversation. And if you don't have that conversation in the beginning, you will have trouble. You will run into problems. And so I think this is why, you know, we partner. This is why we have social workers and psychiatrists and psychologists partnering with computer scientists to be able to elucidate some of those concerns from the very beginning and to weave them throughout the entire research process to make sure that we are always clear, and also confronting our own biases, which we all have, that we need to put on the table as we are moving through the research process. So I completely agree with you, and this has to be at the forefront of doing ethical research.
And I also think about policies too, in terms, because, you know, open science, open data is important. And like you said, there are a lot of risk of, you know, what do people do with that data, or what if they're bad actors when it comes to accessing that data. So, you know, I don't have an answer, but in terms of policies, thinking about, you know, if you have access to this data set, could there be a policy where there are community kind of ambassadors or liaisons that you have to consult with prior to any analyses or prior to any publications? Or can there be, you know, rules of engagement in terms of, you know, how you will benefit the community by accessing this data, et cetera? Could there be trainings in terms of, you know, community-specific, you know, history videos, et cetera, that kind of provide that context? So, you know, I also think about that policy standpoint that we can maybe kind of address it from as well.
I also think this is a really great point, and something that we don't pay enough attention to generally. And I do think that the idea of a community engagement in any analysis plan makes a lot of sense.
Hi, I'm Carrie Ressler, and we'll just add my gratuitous thank you for just such a beautiful and important work, and for sharing it with us. I wonder if you could say, I know this was about really developing it and engaging and how you do the first steps. I'd love to hear a little bit more about next steps. What are the outcomes? How do you know if you're shifting the needle in communities' levels of grief and the sequelae? And then where do you go from there to scale it? You know, we have connections in Atlanta and Boston. We'd love to find ways to help scale this to communities of color in other cities with similar problems. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we probably all have ideas about next steps, and I think, you know, it's a good problem to have. But one of the great things about this is there are so many directions we can go in terms of next steps. Some of what we're doing right now is, you know, actively still reiterating on the Grief Care for Harlem app, and, you know, our next step for that is to actually take it back to the community, get feedback on, you know, did we get this first pass right? And so really taking our time and making sure that, you know, before we scale up, that, you know, we are reflexive of, you know, and honor the time and feedback that we got from our participants. there are probably other ways, things that I'm forgetting about in terms of next steps too.
I think you did cover it. I mean, when I think about next steps too, I think about the leaders and their thoughts about needing the support ongoing. So I wonder how that can be incorporated. There are a lot of things that I think about. I'm of course very excited about incorporating some level of art or animation as well.
Yeah, I mean, right now where we actually are is we had this app was on a platform which doesn't allow for the kind of interaction that we want, or for that matter, for the kind of even moving around the app that we want. And so we recently discovered Figma, and we now have an undergraduate student who is programming Figma. And so our next step is really right now focused on that, on sort of trying to get something into the Harlem community, because that's what we told them we were going to do. So I think that's part of the outcome, is following up with what we say we're going to do. That we don't have a great history in the field of being able to do that. And after that, I think it's a combination of qualitative and quantitative assessments, and we do have that capacity. I mean, we have a capacity to do qualitative, probably random samples of qualitative interviewing. It might be one possibility, and we also have some really simple digitally applicable, sort of questionnaire type follow-ups that I think we could do too. That was our original plan. We were a little ambitious in our original plan, but was to use a simple 5-item questionnaire, sort of pre and post, in a random sample of the Harlem community. And so I think that's what we were thinking. I don't know if it's sort of very simplistic. And I guess the other thing is bringing the community in at every step. I mean, so that's really where what's in a way slowed us down, you could say, but which we're trying to be very deliberate about.
Then of course we'll need funding for the next step as well, because that's important. Desmond, is anything you want to share about next step for IESO?
Yeah, so I'm thinking a lot about the power of translational AI, and in particular explanation, and how we can use explanatory methods to impact how you all as clinicians think about interweaving the digital into treatment. And so oftentimes these types of expressions of grief that happen on social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram are not necessarily a part of how you think about treatment efforts moving forward. And so one of the things that we're doing in my lab is trying to understand, well, how can we move the needle from being able to extract context and identify some of these psychological concepts and be able to interweave them into treatment and community care. And so we're kind of thinking about what does explanation and translational AI look like for the future. And so that's those are our next steps.
So one other thing is that we do have an online training program for our intervention, and we also hold workshops. And Henry and I and Nicole will be we'll be integrating all of this into our workshops and also into the digital. We're working right now on integrating it, and what Desmond said reminded me of that, and hopefully we'll get some IESO input as well. We haven't talked about it yet, but we will.
This is actually a really boring question. Since you brought up funding, Laura and I were commenting on this, how much funding would you recommend be put in a grant budget to support the community liaison or the people? Because we don't do this, and you sort of expect that people will do this out of the goodness of the heart or because, they love Athens or whatever. But if you could just, you've probably thought about this quite deeply, like very concretely, when you're planning to build a project in this realm, how do you think about what resources to invest in that community resource, the community liaison building?
Actually, yeah, I want to answer this because the answer is simple, and that is that Dr. Green was part of this project from the funders were not, they were like taken aback by that, but we planned it with him. He was the linchpin for the, basically for the community effort. He's the one who got all the community partners to work with us, and we asked him, what do you need to do this? And actually he had a really good answer. He knew what he needed. He knew what the I think the community participants, if they're brought in as true partners, they do know. And it was a substantial amount of our budget, and none of it was enough. What else is it?
Yeah, and I would say, the rationale that we approached it with was, we were treating them not as participants, but as experts, domain experts, as Dr. Patton mentioned. And so when you think about, how much do you pay a consultant on a study on an hourly basis? So thinking about it in that term, in terms of how much to pay, and then also thinking about, what it means and how much that amount means. So we had participants say, we know you respect us, or we know that you are, really, cognizant of our time and what we're sacrificing to be here because of how much we, allow, compensated folks. So I think that's kind of how we approached it.
Can I just add something? Mm-hmm. So I love all these points, and one of the things that I think we should be very clear about is that you will get pushback for paying your domain experts what they should be paid. There isn't understanding from an IRB perspective about why we would pay someone the way we're paying them. It's not something, as you've already noted, that is done a lot in research space. And so I think having your arguments, clear and really making the case for why the ways in which you engage folks is different from participation, I think is going to matter because there will be pushback.
This is a bit of a selfish question from a trauma person, but and with Dr. Shear's longstanding work in traumatic grief as another approach, and I wonder. I guess it's a two-part question. One, how you talked a bit about trauma throughout the stories, but is there a different take that needs to be thought about from the more traumatic side versus the grief side, or is it kind of all rolled in there together? And what we saw a lot in Atlanta with the Grady Trauma Project was particularly with gun violence and at times around gang violence, how often that cycle of violence was really about unmitigated loss. You killed somebody, I lost somebody, I'm going to extract revenge, and how perhaps being able to help communities grieve could help maybe stem that cycle. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, you have articulated exactly why I started to partner and do research with Kathy, because that is exactly what I saw in online communication. One of the things, I think, most important findings that I've had in my research is that we would oftentimes see young people that self-identified as being gang involved. They would use social media to cope with loss, and they would be extremely expressive and vulnerable about the moment, about what they're going through, what they're feeling, what other people don't understand about their grief. And what we would see is that within their social media environment, other individuals who are not connected to them or they were not friends with. So in the gang violence space, we call them the ops or the opposition. They would start to disrespect their grief or make fun of their grief or have, lots of negative comments to say about their grief. And we saw within 2 days that the original poster who was posting about grief, their language on social media, in particular Twitter at the time, would shift towards more aggressive and threatening communication within a 2-day period. And so I think we had missed an opportunity to think about the role of grief as an antecedent for more aggressive and threatening posts. We were not treating it as such.
And I think Desmond is being a little bit overly something, because I believe you have a book. Is it in press, or is it about this topic? Desmond? I'm sorry, say that again? I believe you have a book in press. Is it in press or published? I've lost track of it. Oh, I know that routine. But it should be out soon, right? I mean, yes, and it's an amazing story. It's published in some papers, but I'm looking forward to reading the book myself. Okay, we have 5 more minutes. Anybody?
Since we do.
Okay.
So this is it's about something that I think was briefly alluded to, but as someone that works with older adults, I was curious just in your conversations whether there were specific aspects of grief related to the experience of Black elders who they have a very specific place in the community, and Harlem there's one Harlem, as Scott said, but I was curious if you had anecdotal or database stories of whether the experience of the Black elder was different than the younger age groups. And I ask this particularly because through COVID, we found that older adults across the board seem to have withstood the stress and the trauma of the pandemic a lot better than the younger age groups. But there haven't been good data thus far on whether there was that differential in Black communities specifically, and especially because they hold a lot of that generational and historical trauma. So just curious what you found or in this study or otherwise in your experiences.
Thank you for that question. One thing we found was that the older adults had experienced more losses due to COVID, and that was really surprising, I think, for both of us. The other thing was, as you talked about the historical trauma, particularly one Black elder talked about the experience of knowing of in the South, where I believe a family member had been their body had been separated on a railroad station or a train station or something, and the impact of that and how they carry that, they still carry that to this day. Whereas the younger group, it was more, I felt that it was more around police brutality and those experiences. So yes, there was quite a difference.
Yeah, and yeah, we didn't get to go much into it during the talk, but yeah, those experiences of community-wide grief. And when we think about community-wide grief, it was specifically more of those kind of Black elders or Black community leaders that had been a stable force. And we had plenty of pastors. I can't remember the name of the person who had passed recently, but they were, they really described how hard it hit them and kind of how it kind of reverberated through the community in terms of what that loss and subsequent grief meant for them. And then going back to that developmental piece, it is interesting because even now as we're still continuing to dig into the qualitative data, pick out more nuances, but again, a lot of what the youth are talking about, they're not talking about losing a lot of elders or older family members. Again, it's more of those kind of same age peers or kind of more community experiences. And so I think that's a really great point in terms of thinking about that.
And also, in listening to the focus groups, and there's the differences in the experiences, there's also the difference in the reaction. And I think you would agree that the older group talked much more about this, having to be strong, having to be strong for other people and carrying this weight inside. They just carried a weight inside themselves. Whereas the younger people talked about this numbness that you pointed out, and the older people, part of why we did this, the younger people focus groups, is because they were saying that the younger people seemed numb to them, and that is exactly what they said they were, right? And so there was that difference, more of a trauma-like response, and I guess a lot of those deaths were very traumatic deaths, so maybe that's what they were seeing, but the older people seemed to hold it basically, right? And more ready to release it also, would you say, and more, got a huge amount of relief, much more so than the younger ones did from the focus groups themselves, which might be a clue to that other question about what might be most helpful.
Desmond, would you like to add anything?
I think just 2 points. I think what was very clear for me is that the younger folks spoke a lot about their experiences and exposure to gun violence, which seemed to really permeate conversation. And I was also quite delighted to hear the younger folks talk about their connection to seeking therapy related to their grief exposure as well. And I would say a lot of this was coming from younger Black men in ways that I have not heard in my prior research before.
I think if you wanted to publish or parse out the data specific to older Black adults, the genocide community would be grateful for it.
Yeah, that's great. And I just want to say one other follow-up of this is that these guys are did an in-person grief group drawing on some of what they learned from this in a really innovative church in the Harlem community, the First Corinthian Baptist Church, where in addition to funding a mental health clinic associated with the church, which for a Black Baptist church is not exactly the usual thing, or it hasn't been in the past, I would say, right? But in addition to that, I was invited to a service honoring that clinic that I attended, I would say. The pastor in the sermon spoke openly of her mental health treatment over a number of years of her psychotherapy, and the senior pastor in that church also frequently talks openly about his therapy experience, which again I think is a really positive development. We ran out of time. Thank you all so much. Thank everyone here. Thank you.